So I'm here in Meursault, standing in the climat of Rougeot and looking out over the adjacent vineyard of Les Chevalières. And I think it's an interesting spot to talk about some of the factors that influence the quality and character of white Burgundy. As well as we tend increasingly these days to fixate on differences in geology and soil type. And here, in fact, you can see two rather flagrant differences occurring within the space of just a few meters between the red soils of Rougeot that give it its name, and also meant that it was historically planted with Pinot Noir, and over there, the whiter, much whiter soils of Chevalières. And when you taste the wines, Rougeot tends to be blockier, more muscular, Chevalières more chiseled and decisive. It's very tempting to attribute those stylistic differences to these very evident, tangible differences in soil. I think when you taste the wines farmed the same way and made the same way by the same producer as you can do in the cellars of Domaine Corcherie, then it's actually quite plausible to look for these nuances and shadings in origins such as these. But I do think also that emphasis on soil and geology comes sometimes at the expense of some of the other important influences on wine style. One of the most important is clearly altitude. Right here we're at about 260 meters. The appellation of Meursault begins down there on the flat land, about 230 meters, and it rises fully 100 meters more up the hillside behind us. Now that translates to several weeks difference in ripening, and even when the fruit at the top of the hillside gets ripe, it's always going to have more acidity and different gustative properties to the grapes here, and certainly the grapes down below. So I think that's hugely important and one of the most obvious things, but absolutely decisive. Another clearly is inclination and aspect. Here this is a moderate slope, as you can see, and southeast facing. So most of the sort of famous vineyards of the heart of the Côte d'Or have a similar exposition, in fact. But equally, you can see that Burgundy comprehends a vast variety of different expositions. And right here, the hillside turns around to my north, and the vineyards become progressively more and more east-facing. Then in the distance, you can see the appellations, or parts of the appellations of Marseille-Bresse and Montpellier. Again, some of those appellations have wildly varying expositions, spanning full 360-degree differences. So, again, when grapes see the sunshine, how much sunshine they see, is it in the morning, is it in the evening, all of these nuances really affect the kind of juice they produce, the kind of wine that they make. Related to inclination and to altitude quite strongly is soil hydrology. Can the vines get the water they need when they need it? And this is a factor that is probably the most dynamic of all the things that I'm talking about today, because these drier and drier vintages in Burgundy 2020 that we've just seen, just harvested here but not harvested there, is an absolutely prime example of that. Historically, it was an advantage to be on the slope because the problem was too much water. Today, the problem is not enough water, and being in very well-draining soils is no longer necessarily the advantage that it once was. So I think we begin to see sites that have deeper soils with better water retentive capacity start to perform much, much better. And sites sometimes up on the slopes where there's not much soil and they're very well-draining, they start to suffer. Beyond those considerations, I think the single important factor that's the least talked about of all of the important influences is in fact airflow, air drainage. The combe up here of Marseille-Bresse is a great example of that, because cool winds flow down from there, as they do through all of the gaps in the hills of the Côte d'Or, and the cooling influence of those winds obviously changes the fruit that they impact. So certainly the climat like Les Chevaux just round the corner that's more east-facing and gets this cool wind, I mean, it's no surprise it should produce a much more acid-driven, angular wine than Rougeot here, basking in the sun. And I think it's plausible, in fact, we've talked a little about the soil differences between these two parcels, but it's plausible to imagine that Chevalières sees a little more of that cooling influence from the combe than Rougeot does. in any case, those are, I think, for me, the most obvious decisive factors that influence the character and quality of these wines. In the vineyard, the physical factors. In that respect, I think they're more or less applicable to red Burgundy as well as to white, and in fact to other regions as well. In another couple of videos, I'm going to be talking about the human element, which is viticulture and winemaking. But in the meantime, I hope you enjoyed this one.